Okay, hey guys, so it's around 7:10, so I'll just get started now. So of course, I know we're around midterms are still going on, so thank you everyone for being here and joining us today. My name is Jane, and so today we're going to showcase a variety of environmental justice organizations that exist, uplift their work, and just understand more about the work and organizations surrounding our environmental community. So this specific event is put on by the Green Community Corps of the Student Environmental Resource Center membership program, also known as CERC, and it is funded by the Green Initiative Fund. So it will also be recorded, so everything you can find the recording on CERC affiliate accounts and sites. So this specific event is part of the Earth Justice Month, which is like October, and you can find more information about Earth Justice Month projects on the CERC website. And so today we'll be asking some questions to our panelists. And yeah, so if anything comes up during the event, you can type them in the Q&A and we will reserve the last 10 minutes to answer them. So yeah, I would love to thank, of course, the panelists for joining us today. And before we start, we want to acknowledge that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Hyochon, which continues to be a great importance to the Ohlone people. So because we are part of the Berkeley community, we have continued to benefit from the usage of the land. And it's important to take time to better understand the history of the land and the members of the Ohlone community that are still present within Berkeley. So with that being said, now I'll give it to Grace to introduce the panelists.
Hi, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our panelists today. We have a very diverse group of panelists, and we are so excited to see what they have to say about their role in the environmental justice community. So Eddie Ahn is the executive director of Brightline Defense, which is an environmental justice nonprofit based in San Francisco. He is also currently a commissioner for the San Francisco Commission on the Environment, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and also the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And Eddie's pronouns are he, his. Neena Mohan is a UC Berkeley alumni and the Climate Justice Program Associate for the California Environmental Justice Alliance, who is working to fulfill the same goal as this very panel is doing right now, which is to uplift environmental justice communities. And Neena's pronouns are they and she. And finally, we have Jessica Ho, and Jessica received her master's degree at UC Berkeley, and in her time here became the founder and executive director of the Museum of Tomorrow, which is an interactive pop-up museum that encourages people to make sustainable lifestyle changes. But these days, she is spending her time in Taiwan, where she is working with the Go Green initiative on the Energy Star Portfolio project, and Jessica's pronouns are she, her. So we're just going to begin with questions for all of the panelists, and after that we are going to have questions that you, the members, the audience of this panel, can ask. So feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, but for now we're going to start out with a question for all of the panelists, which is, what does environmental justice mean to you?
Anyone starting? I guess I can start. To me, I have a really simple understanding of environmental justice. It means that everyone, regardless of class, age, and color, should be able to live properly and enjoy the benefits that nature brings. Right now, a lot of people of color or low-income communities are struggling to even survive. And I've come to understand that more personally after working with Earth Team, and environmental education nonprofit working with Title I high school students. And the best scenario to me, I would like to see that there are no sacrifice zones where it is highly toxic and people start attending their high school reunions at funerals at 30 years old. So that's my basic understanding after 1 year of actually working in this realm.
I'll go. To me, it's evolution of what the environmental movement was originally, a broader understanding and a more diverse understanding, an approach toward environmental solutions. It's looking at that intersection between race, the environment, and the economy. So hopefully through a lot of lenses, we can get at more equitable movement on environmental issues.
I guess I'll go next. Thanks so much for having me on this panel. I think for me, I think there's a lot of different ways to approach environmental justice. I think one is kind of the more traditional definition, which speaks to kind of the different distributions, either equitable or not equitable, of environmental burdens and benefits. And right now we see that marginalized communities are often the ones that are facing the brunt of the burdens. But I like to personally take a little bit of a more broader view on environmental justice and kind of view EJ as the lens through which we can tackle some of the root causes of inequity, injustice, kind of systems of oppression in our world. So these are things like capitalism, queerphobia, racism, xenophobia, etc. And I kind of look at it this way because to me, I think environmental justice asks us to question and reevaluate what our relationship is to the land, to other people, and in that way almost to ourselves. And I think it's an inherently anti-capitalist framework which values people and nature over profits. So because of that, I think I view environmental justice more broadly and use it to kind of think about sustainability beyond just environmental issues and really think about the sustainability of our relationships of communities in a way that can be more ecological and that can be more equitable.
Great answers. I think a lot of you guys brought up questions about intersectionality and community, how those are both very important. So I'm wondering, another question that I have would be, how have you been able to find your place in the community specifically, considering how intersectional it is? And where is a good place to start for budding environmentalists who aren't necessarily sure how to get their footing? Neena, since you kind of talked a lot about a sense of community, I'm wondering if you would like to start.
Yeah, sure. So I feel like I actually found my place and found my voice in EJ work through UC Berkeley. I was part of the Students of Color Environmental Collective, which is a group on campus that I think is still active. And that for me felt like a good place to start, and it provided me with that sense of community, with kind of a shared experience of other students of color who were going through environmental classes at UC Berkeley. And I would say, a good place for other people to start is just to look at your own community. I think you could think about what issues you're experiencing, what issues other people might be experiencing. And if you're not directly impacted, I can probably bet you that there's people who are impacted that are already doing the work. And I think that's a place where you can reach out and lend your support, leverage your privileges. And if you are at UC Berkeley, which I'm assuming many of the the attendees here are, I would definitely suggest just looking around in the community, because there's a bunch of environmental justice organizations and community gardens and other places that you can get involved. So yeah, I would say just look around and you'll probably find something to plug into.
I can go as the middle person again. So to describe Brightline as a nonprofit a little more, we specialize in coalition building, a lot of organizing across different stakeholders. And Brightline is not your typical direct service provider in the nonprofit sphere. A lot of our work is looking at what can be uniquely added to the space, whether it's specific attention on policy, bringing different stakeholders which normally don't work together. So just to give you an example of the geography of San Francisco, where this is an American city that's heavily divided along racial lines, along class lines. It does have a liberal political spectrum, but it's just as heavily segregated as any other city in the United States. And just even getting different community-based organizations from different neighborhoods to interact with each other takes a lot of effort. And so for us, we like to think through accountability in this work through locality. So at the end of the day, hopefully we are accountable to the local grassroots communities we represent, and then just owning who we are, personally as Asian American, or even more specifically a Korean American. I can't speak to every experience, but hopefully one can be for community at the end of the day without being of community. So just trying to think through that distinctions and being humble about one's own position in society. I mean, people phrase it a lot of different ways, like checking your privilege or whatever it may be, but just owning who you are and then coming from a place of respecting the other person's viewpoint is really important.
I would echo what Eddie said on finding your passion and just go for it. Whether it is environmental design, agricultural, if you have passion in waste, fashion, sustainable materials, there are so many places that you can start that actually interest you. And as long as you are very interested and passionate about that subject, you will succeed at anything that you do. So don't be afraid to work with waste. My first conscious environmental experience was when I held the chair of a waste sorter in middle school. And I kid you not, I was judged on how well we sort trash. And of course, I was able to win awards for my homeroom classroom sorting trash. And that experience really brought a sense of how do you say it? Accomplishment. That's the word for me. And I find a pride and purpose in doing so. And since then, I've been devoting myself in effective environmental education. So in high school, I tried to found a club on environmental education, but failed because most of my other friends just wanted to fill their resume. In college, I act as a advocate for recycling at parties. So whenever I attend parties, I tell them to remember to recycle their beer bottles or whatnot. But it wasn't until my master's degree I found it something that actually went off the ground a little bit that I call Museum of Tomorrow. And I would encourage anyone to explore wherever your interest lies, and you will find something there.
You guys give a lot of inspiration for future environmentalists. Thank you for your answers. Now I have a question specifically for Neena. I know that we've been talking a lot about intersectionality, and Jessica just mentioned the idea of trial and error and how many different experiences come together to shape who you are as a person and your role in the environmental justice movement. So my question for you is, what experiences have shaped your expertise about environmental work specifically?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I definitely don't think I'm an expert, but I feel like I've had a lot of different experiences that have allowed me to gain just different sorts of perspective. So as I mentioned, I started off kind of in the EJ space as a student organizer on UC Berkeley's campus, and I think that was a really helpful experience just in me, you know, finding my voice, learning how to speak up, how to bring different issues to attention. But it was still very much like within kind of what I like to call the Berkeley bubble. I think people call it that. So it wasn't until I graduated and actually started working that I got kind of a broader view. So I've worked at nonprofits, kind of doing more state level policy work specifically regarding like equity and environmental justice issues. And that was super eye-opening to me. I think that really gave me the understanding of like, just how small the group of people that make super big decisions is. And it might seem kind of obvious, but I think it really just hit me of like, oh, there's these few people that are really dictating what like hundreds and thousands of people's lives are going to look like with their decisions. So I think that also really informed my views around like democracy and around organizing and the importance of ensuring that the most impacted voices were represented and were uplifted. I also spent some time working in local government, actually at Alameda County. And that was also a really interesting experience. I worked on climate adaptation and equity issues. And there I got to do a lot more kind of research-based stuff. So really thinking about different indicators and things like that when it comes to climate change adaptation, climate change resilience, and then how communities might be impacted by those different effects. And so, yeah, I think, having a breadth of experience is just super important. At least to me, I feel like it really helped inform what I wanted to do. And right now I work as the Climate Justice Program Associate at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a statewide policy organization that's basically comprised of 10 different grassroots environmental groups across the state. And one thing that I would really emphasize that I've just been super grateful to experience is just being in community with EJ leaders and people that are directly impacted. I think, that's probably the thing that shaped my experience the most, is just hearing from them firsthand, what are the problems, and then what are the solutions that they're trying to uplift. And for me, that's just been kind of the thing that shaped my understanding about EJ work. And I think that's an important thing, just to learn how to like truly deeply listen to people. I think that's important to being an advocate.
Thank you. And Eddie, I feel like Neena's response to that does kind of tie into your work as working with Brightline Defense. So, environmental law does kind of have to do with working with the disenfranchised and also dealing with people who kind of have the stronghold on power. So my question for you is, how applicable is environmental law to our everyday life? And how can community members become more informed and engaged about it?
It depends what sphere you're talking about. So there are a lot of environmental policymaking institutions in California. They range from what people are most familiar with would be like the state legislature, the governor, and then, the and maybe, just maybe, like the associated regulatory agencies. That's its own very particular space, like the California Public Utilities Commission, the California Energy Commission, California Air Resources Board. These are huge, sprawling agencies with a lot of decision-making power, but most lay people don't really understand deeply how, or even community advocates don't necessarily understand deeply how these institutions work. And, environmental lawyers can engage. For instance, there are a number of administrative legal proceedings that are ongoing at the CPUC, but the challenges are pretty significant. There are very big barriers to your average person just trying to, engage in these proceedings, because they have their own binder, for instance, a rule, a guidebook of practices and procedures that you're supposed to follow. And it's basically being, in some ways, a heavy grammar, oriented typist. Like, you have to format it in a certain legal briefing style. And, I've seen commissioners go off on this process talking about how inaccessible it is at the end of the day. And I think generally that's a challenge, is that sometimes the intricacies of policies you're working on just aren't that translatable at the end of the day to community concerns. Brightline tries to work at it. I don't know if we're successful all the time. And I think a lot of other organizations struggle with this as well. So just I think it's just important to have different life skill sets before even going into policy advocacy work generally. Understanding, for instance, what is service provision on the nonprofit side, what is community organizing. Like, advocacy just doesn't happen in a vacuum. Otherwise, it's just you asserting your own opinion for its own sake. That's not terribly helpful to the sphere. So having some substance behind it is always important in order to be able to relate environmental laws to community.
Great, thank you so much for your answer. And so it kind of sounds like you really need to have a good base before you decide to go into the more, not useful, but, the very much more powerful sides of environmental justice or law. And so, Jessica, my question for you is, it seems like college is really a great place for people to get that foundation and get that footing and know where they how they can specifically continue their environmental justice work. And obviously that's why we have these people on the panel, to learn how they can really make that jump. So you were a UC Berkeley alumni. You went there for your master's. You just graduated last year, so congratulations. How has UC Berkeley been a catalyst for your environmental work, and how have these resources helped to launch your career?
The 2 years at Berkeley has been the most growth I've ever experienced in my entire life, not just because of the resources, but also from the people that I interact on a daily basis, because everyone is so intelligent and also so competitive. It kind of pushes you forward. I wasn't always the brightest in school, but one thing I did right was to learn about the different campus resources available for me and to take advantage of it. So I would really encourage anyone listening to dream big and to take advantage of the resources around you. From the start, I decided to enter the Big Ideas Social Venture Competition available for all UC students, which actually shaped my whole experience at Berkeley. So after coming up with that business model for Museum of Tomorrow, I actually applied that business model for all of the classes. Well, like at least one class for every semester that I've been taking. So whether it's survey design, whether it's evaluating data, whether it's business model planning, I was able to take that and refine it in the different classes. So it started from a basic proposal, but actually became a real project with real people. You establish different connections and talk to people that you won't ever dream of talking to. And people are getting to know you, also your project. But I think the biggest asset is definitely your peers, your talented peers around you. They will not let you down. So I would encourage you to work something up with your friends. And 3 years from the idea, I'm still now working on Museum Tomorrow. Currently, we have 12 members, and we've established partnership with governments, NGOs, and private companies. People start knowing Museum Tomorrow before they start knowing you. So that was a really grounding experience for me.
Great, thank you so much for your answer. And so now I have a couple of questions just for all of you now. It seems like resources are very important, as is finding a community, but for the person who has no clue where to start, how can people really learn more about environmental justice work?
I think the best place to start is probably volunteering. There's a number of great organizations, SEHA, one of them. You could always volunteer at Brightline too. I think the nonprofit space in the Bay Area is very rich, so you're lucky in that regard. I think, you know, you may not agree with everything whatever organization you're at does, but it'll help you, inform you what you don't like at the very least, and then you can move from there as well.
Yeah, I would definitely second that and say volunteering is a great way to just test different things out, see what you like, see what you don't. And I think, yeah, definitely will help inform what you want to do in the future. And I also think, you know, to really take advantage of the fact that you're in school right now, see if you can take classes on EJ, you know, read books, read articles, organize with other folks. You can even start like a study group or like a book club about EJ stuff. There's a lot of resources out there. Yeah, that it's not too hard to get connected to with just like a quick Google search. And just another quick plug, if you are a student of color, definitely check out SCEC or other types of environmental organizations on campus. I think that they can, you know, again, provide that sense of community and like good foundation for learning more about the work together. And I think there's also a mentorship program for students of color and in the environmental field as well. So I would also recommend looking into that.
Yeah, I would echo with both of them. Volunteer at organizations doing specifically environmental justice field work. So you can actually be present with the people from that community, get to know them as a person. You can learn about environmental justice all on theory and on paper, but you can't really understand the issue until you actually went in there and be immersed in the environment. Earth Team is the organization that really grounded my environmental justice understanding, and just get to know the people. And I have another note saying, have a transect walk in their community. So pay attention to their sounds, the greens on their streets or the lack of thereof. Just take a stroll through their neighborhoods and you will be surprised at what you find.
Thank you so much for those great resources. And so I'm thinking about people who want to take the next step, who know that they're interested about environmental justice and who have found their foundation, but who understand how intersectional all of this is and who aren't really sure what they want to specify in or specialize in. So what are some issues that we should be cognizant of when tackling issues about environmental injustices? Eddie, because you are an attorney at Brightline Defense, I'm wondering if you have any ideas about that.
This is in regards to undergraduate student approaching the work, or is it beyond, like once one graduates from college, how should you approach the work?
Well, I guess the question is just what are some issues in general? Because our audience is mostly college students. If you would like to view it in that lens, that would be useful.
So the range of policies that Brightline works on, it's broad. So we work on, just programmatically speaking, job training programs, for instance, that focus on transitional age youth, ages 17 through 21. And typically it's in the field of construction. And we focus on key workforce development policy concepts that tie into that job training program, such as local hiring. So local hiring is just even the idea when you have economic development in the area, you target a percentage of those work hours involved in the whatever project for local underemployed, unemployed communities. Oftentimes, whether it doesn't have to be construction, it could be any number of things, like say a tech company, or even in the clean tech, renewable energy sphere, you'll often hear employers talk about and defend their lack of workforce diversity as being an employee problem, that there's just not nearly enough qualified applicants of color, for instance, will be one refrain you might hear. And then they'll say, well, why don't we just focus on STEM, education and building up the pipeline? I was just describing this earlier today. The challenge with that kind of approach is that assumes that 10, 15, 20 years from now, then change will occur. And a lot of the people who are frustrated want change now. I think that's a challenge. And that, not to undercut, attempts to, invest in education and make it better, more equitable. But generally, we should also be focused not just on job training or STEM education. We should be focused on job placement and strategies to intentionally get to, there are qualified applicants out there. So how can we legally structure policies, for instance, that will require employers to hire more equitably? And that's a lot of work that Brightline has worked on in the past. We've advised cities on how to constitutionally create constitutionally sound laws, for instance, around local hiring. So a lot of that work requires both the policy technical knit and grit that may not exist on the pure advocacy side. For instance, there's been a number of times in San Francisco alone where a community coalition has come to the steps of City Hall to demand a local hiring policy. And all it takes is for a deputy city attorney to turn away that coalition and say, no, it's unconstitutional for X, Y, Z reasons. And if there's not legal talent to bolster the other side, that becomes problematic. So I think like gaining skill sets generally that are additive to the movement are really important. And then also trying to translate what the community wants into actual policy is also part of the challenge.
Go next. Yeah, definitely echo a lot of Eddie's experience, especially on those last 2 points. And I think, when we're thinking about like the issues within environmental justice movement, I think what comes up for me in a lot of my work right now is similar about thinking about the just transition and thinking about, the transition off of fossil fuels, off of a polluting economy into a regenerative, renewable economy. And I think what comes up here is just, there's a lot of difficulty in getting different folks to come to the table together who might historically not like each other. And I think that is especially difficult, but it's critical that, we're talking to people in the fossil fuel industry, we're talking to workers, we're talking to impacted residents, and really trying to bring folks together in order to create solutions that work for everybody. So I think that's definitely like a major thing that comes up, is really trying to bring together different stakeholders. I would also say, just as a student getting into this work, approaching this work, and this also goes back to Eddie's point earlier, is just to really be mindful of your positionality within the work. I think especially if you're not a directly impacted person, you're probably not going to be the one that's going to come up with the best solution because you're not experiencing all the things that the impacted person is experiencing. And so I think it's really important in the work to make space for EJ communities to demonstrate the expertise that they have through their own lived experience, and make space for them to engage in self-advocacy, to exercise their own self-determination. I think that's super critical. And one other thing I just mentioned to just kind of, be wary of is just thinking about the organizations that you do choose to work with. I think, historically, there's been a lot of stuff that's come to light, especially recently, about some of the historical harms that mainstream big environmental organizations have caused to Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And I think at this time, within the whole movement, folks are really reckoning with that history and reckoning with that harm. And are trying to incorporate more environmental justice into their work, even if they don't work with directly impacted folks. And so I would just say, just to be mindful of that, to do your research on who you're choosing to work with before getting deeply involved.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. Give them space, give EJ community space to demonstrate their expertise, and be good listeners. Listen and learn from their stories and voices. Oftentimes people from the outside communities want to come in and save the day by imposing what they think is best. For example, to encourage biking, people installed bike paths. But after talking to them, my students, and asking them why the biking rate still isn't increasing, they mentioned the lack of bike racks on campus. And sometimes parents are wary to let their children bike on their own due to the violence and busy traffic in their area. So instead, in this case, a carpooling initiative among high school peers would be more effective than installing very expensive bike paths that does literally nothing, and decongesting traffic and reducing emissions for this specific community. And I demonstrated this earlier. Another thing I wanted to mention is to avoid savior language. A lot of people come in saying that they're going to save the day, but whatnot. But that's something that we should be cognizant about when doing these kind of work.
Thank you for all of your answers. You've given our attendees a lot to think about, and I feel like we've left them more confident about taking the next step. So now we're going to go into the Q&A section. So those of you who are attending, feel free to ask questions, and our panelists will be answering them. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you guys.
Thank you, Grace. You're a great narrator.
Thank you.
Hi guys, so I'll be handling the audience questions. As Grace said, I'm a member of CERC. Thank you guys all again so much for being here and providing such rich knowledge on a very important discussion. A few of you guys have already touched on this previously, and there's been an emphasis on intersectionality within the environmental justice movement. And this question comes from Sachi. How does your personal history with regards to socioeconomic status, race, ability and sexuality, etc., impact or inform your work? Jessica, if you'd like to go first.
Okay, I was just thinking about an answer. I would always say I am also learning while I go. I am relatively new in the space, so I wouldn't call myself an expert at all. But what I've been observing personally is that I have a group of very, very wealthy friends, and I personally work with not so fortunate communities, and I see a huge disconnect in between the two worlds. And that's one of the reasons why I came up with Museum of Tomorrow, is trying to get different worlds a little bit on the same page, because they will care about different things. But my approach is to find the common between the two groups and try to emphasize what we have in common rather than what we don't. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that was great. Neena or Eddie, if you'd like to jump in and give your insight as well.
Go ahead, Neena. Feel free.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say for me, I mean, I think the way that it's informed my work is just, as we all live intersectional lives, And I think that's just my own intersections have just allowed me to just try and focus on just being self-aware about who I am, my positionality in particular spaces. I think it's allowed me to make connections between different things. One thing I like to talk about a lot that I feel like gets missed is the intersection between climate adaptation and resilience and queer trans identities, thinking about, the specific needs of that population when it comes to things like disaster response or to emergencies, and things that are just generally missing from the discourse around this super critical thing that's only going to get more important as climate change worsens. And so I think for me, it's just allowed me to have, just a broader lens on these various issues and approach them from different angles, and just allows me to kind of shed light on things that I don't necessarily see in the mainstream as much.
I think it's for myself maybe useful to even go back to my childhood and then fast forward as fast as I can through the years. But I grew up in a liquor store that was owned by my family for over 20 years. And it wasn't just one single location. It moved around quite a bit within the state of Texas. It was kind of a quirky business in many respects for my family, which was both my parents were very well educated. They immigrated to the United States to go to graduate school at the University of Texas in Austin. And that's where I was born. And so when they ended up not pursuing their graduate fields of education in electrical engineering and pharmacology, they ended up doing liquor retail instead. And I would say I had a lot of formative experiences in that store. It wasn't what most people think of when they think of a Korean-owned liquor store, which is, probably stemming from anything from like the LA protests that happened over Rodney King, or a Spike Lee film that portrays Korean American store owners as like not understanding of Black communities. It's, I would say our store was a much more, it wasn't a multiracial utopia or anything like that, but it was a much more mixed picture about socioeconomic status in the United States. And from those experiences, one might think I would turn into some kind of rabid capitalist, actually, in the sense that my parents invested a lot in my education. They were super eager for me to go to law school and become a law firm lawyer, like a lot of other Korean American sons and daughters who would then go on to buy their parents a Mercedes-Benz upon graduating from law school. But I always did nonprofit work, unfortunately, for them. And I think that was much to their disappointment, at least in the early years. But it's a pathway I've always pursued more or less throughout my professional career. Even before law school, I started off as a after-school programmer with Oakland Asian Students Educational Services. It's an education nonprofit that you might know works with a lot of UC Berkeley students in Oakland's Chinatown. Nowadays, it's merged with actually as a program of UBASI. But those experiences too inform me about my own Asian American identity, for instance, and how there are nuances, of course, between ethnicities, between nationalities, and just being able to recognize that. I would say each professional experience I've had, and even my legal education experiences really informed what I do and how I do work today. And yeah, it's not, what I do now for Brightline has never been easy. It's been pretty, actually, the personal cost is pretty terrifying. It's a very tough line of work, but I still enjoy it. I think it stems back from that childhood of learning patience in a liquor store.
Thank you so much. I think we can all relate in some one way or another. This question is from priyariley. What is your main goal with regard to environmental justice? It sounds like it's definitely people focused. So Eddie, if you want to start, I know you're working as a lawyer, so.
So this is about the challenges of, well, the question seems to be about the challenges of organizing itself. I think it's hard. It depends on the issue too. So to give maybe one example of environmental justice and air quality monitoring as an issue. So if you had asked me like 2 years ago if I would, hey, Eddie, do you think air quality monitoring is, something you do now? I would have said no. I just never envisioned it as like a field of practice or anything like that for Brightline. It was only after a series of conversations, and then the wildfires themselves really highlighted that air quality issues at the top, have put them at the top of everybody's mind. And so from year to year when this was happening, we talked to a lot of populations and thought through what a program would look like with both youth leaders, with a community service nonprofit that we work with called CYC Community Youth Center, as well as a community organizing arm called Central City SRO Collaborative, which works with a unique housing stock in San Francisco, single room occupancy buildings. And these, just to describe SRO buildings very briefly, they're aging buildings that used to serve a blue-collar immigrant workforce at the turn of the century. And nowadays they've been transitioned into low-income to very low-income tenant housing. These are very small rooms, usually shared by families, and they have shared facilities, whether it's kitchens or bathrooms. So you can just imagine the pressures of the pandemic compounded by heat waves. And then on top of that, if you have bad air quality impacts with a building that doesn't have modern HVAC infrastructure, these are very, very difficult conditions to live in. So for us, like, these are not stakeholders that have, they are aware of each other. CYC, for instance, the education services nonprofit, does serve youth of SRO families. So there are intersections in the work, but it's not common. And then highlighting environmental justice as an issue, such as air quality, it's also not initially at the top of their minds either until something catastrophic like wildfires happens. So just like being able to maintain, like when you're dealing with so many other, I'm using this just in a loose term, environmental factors in one's life, whether it's underemployment, lack of transportation, mental health issues. There could be any number of issues, that community is facing, and that to bring up these very specific environmental justice issues takes a lot of focus. And then for us, like, I think that's part of the challenge, is bringing together these diverse stakeholders just to focus on any particular issue at a point in time. It takes a ton of work.
Yeah, Neena, if you want to jump in on the question, what is your main goal with regard to environmental justice? Priya says it sounds like it's definitely people focused.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I would agree. I think it is definitely people focused. I think that it's kind of what separates it more from what we consider like mainstream environmentalism. And as far as main goal, I think in my work, the way that I approach it, because I work specifically on state policy, I think, I'm really thinking about like, how can we ensure that these policies, laws, programs, things that are being implemented, how can we ensure that these things, as we're trying to move towards, a more climate resilient future, a future with lower greenhouse gas emissions, a future that does not involve fossil fuels, how can we make sure that the people that are most impacted by these issues are, again, not going to be bearing the burdens of this transition, and also are going to be receiving equitable benefits? And so I think of, environmental justice in this context of like, we need to be thinking about how we're going to, build a better, more equitable future for people. And that includes, at least at SEHA, we kind of break our work into 3 different pieces. So thinking about like the climate justice aspects, like air pollution, exposure, transportation justice, access to electric vehicles, also thinking about it from an energy perspective, as I mentioned, in this shift to more of a renewable economy, how are we ensuring that rates aren't, utility rates aren't going to increase on low-income communities, that low-income communities have access to clean energy sources, distributed energy sources. And we also have a green zones program. So thinking about how can we create really holistic essentially green zones, communities where we have good transportation that's run on clean energy, where decisions about how things are set up and the way that they're done are directly informed by the people that live there and are being most impacted by those decisions. I would say all of that is kind of the big picture of what we hope to see for environmental justice. But thinking about in this process of getting there, how are we also trying to rectify past harms that have taken place? The ways that communities have been marginalized in the past, how to undo that, how to heal that. I think that's also part of the goal of environmental justice. Yeah, that was rambly, but hopefully that helped a little.
It's definitely a really great, well-rounded answer. Jessica, if you have anything to add.
I'll keep mine short. Mine isn't as grand as Neena's and Eddie's, but I usually work with youth, and it's just trying to instill a sense of encouragement, a sense of confidence in them that they could be a part of the change that they want to see. There was something that really spoke to me one time when I was doing an interview with one of my interns at Earth Team. She reflected that when she first started joining Earth Team, she thought she could never make a difference because she's just one individual coming from a low-income community. Sometimes she feels she's inferior and she cannot be part of the change. But working on it, on Earth Team, working hands-on on Museum of Tomorrow exhibits that is going to educate a lot of other people, and being able to speak in front of panels, conferences, really gave her the motivation and encouragement that she can make a change. So yeah, that's my take on a more grassroots and individualized encouragement, kind of confidence building approach.
Great, thank you guys so much for answering those questions. We just have one last one from Sharon, and I think this wraps up this pretty much like a really nice bow tie sort of thing. What brings you joy and hope about this work? Jessica, if you'd like to start.
I would just say the example that I just gave really brings me so much hope and joy. It gives me warm, fuzzy feelings. When I first went into Earth Team, the staff are always telling me, you're gonna cry when you leave, or you're gonna be so impacted. Yeah, I really didn't get it. I'm like, okay, you guys are being very over the top, and I don't see I can relate to that. But after working there for a year, I can actually relate to that, and every word is true.
I really liked Jessica's articulation about education earlier and its meaning, and I really appreciate Neena's thoughts about empowerment as well. I think that's really important for the work. I think generally, if you do nonprofit work for a long time, you'll realize it's not terribly rewarding in the sense that you are not going to be able to celebrate, the end of poverty or a silver bullet solution at the end of the day. It's extremely grinding. There are often compromises you have to make that you will not like. And it's really difficult, I would say. I think it's something to take joy in if you're able to create a more sustainable solution in the form of just making sure the next generation of folks who come after you can hopefully carry on. And for me, I thought a lot about Brightline's policy fellowship program in the past. It used to be easy to convene people in person at the office. And when it became teleworking, it became really brutal. The amount of work involved in just trying to create that same relationship, which used to be a 5-10 second conversation, now becomes an act of chasing someone down through phone call or email. That's all exhausting. And in fact, we were thinking of just taking away the policy fellowship entirely. But I go back to the idea of education and empowerment and how important that is for the movement generally. And we'll do some version of our fellowship program in the future, because those aspects are really important to me personally, and that's what gives me hope and joy at the end of it.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick here. Yeah, I can definitely also appreciate a lot of what Eddie mentioned, and I think, you know, it is super difficult work. It's really draining work. And, you know, when you're talking about goals, like I was describing in the previous question, it doesn't seem like something that, you know, we'll be able to achieve as quickly as we would hope to, right? Like hopefully within our lifetimes. So I think when you're doing work like that and you're also faced with such a looming existential threat like climate change, and you're also up against people with a lot of money and a lot of power, it can be really, really hard. But I think what gets me through it is just celebrating the little victories. So I'll just share an example. You know, a lot of what we do is try to improve public health for EJ communities. And so recently we were trying to get a bill passed this legislative cycle that would have created basically buffer zones or setback distances between where fossil fuel production takes place and then where communities are living, working, going to school. Because right now in the state of California, there's no minimum distance, and you can have a fossil fuel plant right next to a hospital, and that is not good. But that bill did not pass this year, which is really sad. But we had a lot of wins at the local level, where in cities and counties, ordinances were passing that would create setback distances and health and safety zones. And, you know, even if it's not the whole state, I think it's important to celebrate all of the work that goes into achieving something like that, and then continuing to work to scale up those types of solutions for everybody. So that brings me a lot of joy, just reflecting on how much we have accomplished, because it's a lot.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jessica, Neena, and Eddie so much for all your insight on environmental works and how us as students can start getting involved and start our journey in EJ. So yeah, we'll be closing now. And so I guess for the audience, if you guys ever want to come back and see any specific parts of today's webinar, you can find the recordings on the CERC websites or different accounts. And so continuing our Earth Justice Month programming, tomorrow we do have our Facing Fast Fashion, the true cost documentary screening and discussion. So more information on that will be found on CERC Facebook or CalLink, and I hope to see everyone again tomorrow. So yeah, thank you guys so much, panelists, and to the audience.